Made a thread at the start of the year about some weird experiences I had as a Boy Scout. I'll just post what I had in here. I've lived my entire life in Oklahoma, and it's probably just about as rural as most of you think it is. Outside of Oklahoma City, Moore, Norman area, and Tulsa, Oklahoma is mostly small towns, casinos, and lots of woods and open plains. Backcountry galore, a perfect place to teach young scouts the basics without throwing them right into the heat of the fray. It's usually pretty quiet everywhere you go, and people are generally friendly. We're the definition of a flyover state. If there's one thing people probably immediately relate to Oklahoma, it's Indian/native land/reservation/folklore/etc. While this stuff isn't prevalent in bigger cities, it becomes incredibly prominent as you enter the more rural parts of the state. For those curious, I'm not sure how much land is still legally considered native, but it's probably more than any other state. This particular incident occurred the summer of 2011 at a scout camp, not too far from the Oklahoma/Texas border. This was the last trip I ever made out there, and I don't really regret it. Camp lasts Sunday through Saturday 1 week. Arrive on Sunday, work on merit badges Monday, Thursday, chill Friday, leave Saturday. The leaders of my troop were comprised almost entirely of one family, whom I'll call the Perkins. There was a great-grandfather, C, the grandfather, D, and the grandson, Buck. C was about 75 when I joined, and fit the crotchety old man stereotype like a glove. He was abrasive, impatient, and quick to lose his temper, while at the same time happy to help any boy who didn't ask stupid questions. C was also a war veteran, not sure which war though. D was a lot like his father, except, cryptic? I guess what I'm trying to say is that you could tell D had seen some shit. He was a little out there. Very my way or the highway. Do what I say if you don't want to die kind of guy. Probably 60-ish, built like a bear. The man was massive and intimidating, and he knew it. To this day, I think D knows a hell of a lot more about this particular incident than he'll ever tell, but I never had the courage to ask him about anything. Buck, their grandson, was about a year older than me. Buck was a bit thick in the head, but he was tough and built like his granddad. He was also as loyal as a golden retriever, and the word fear wasn't exactly in his rather limited vocabulary, but I digress. Another key player was my best friend at the time, Dylan. Dylan was stubborn, headstrong, and generally looking for trouble. He and I started scouts together at 6, and were the only two that had stuck together since that time. We were usually inseparable, which probably saved our lives that night. Now, I was the opposite of Dylan. I was meek, easily scared, and suffered from constitutional delay, which means that I looked like I was 10 even though I was 15, pick related. I'm the scrawny kid in blue. This was taken earlier in 2011 around April. So anyway, we had been to scout camp for as long as I'd been involved with the troop, every summer, usually in June or July. We'd make our week trip down there and head home. Dylan and I knew what the camp was supposed to feel like and sound like, as did C and D, who had been going there for 20 odd years or so. This year, we immediately knew something was off. Have you ever walked into a place and just felt like bad vibes? Like bad energy just kind of taking up residence somewhere. It was kind of like that the moment we drove through the gates. The younger boy seemed pretty oblivious, but I knew Dylan felt like I did. And D? Man, I don't think I've ever seen D as tense as he was that whole week. He was normally pretty chillaxed, if a little strict, but he was on edge the moment we arrived on the grounds until we left on Saturday. I suppose the best way to do this from here on out is to give a chronological account of events that happened day to day over the week. That's the only way I can think to do this without losing myself in you guys. The first thing you do when arriving at the camp is to drive to the registration office to confirm campsites, number of boys, sleepers, etc. We did this, but D was gone for a very long time. When he came back, he was being escorted by the camp ranger, as D was hopping back into the sedan. I remember hearing the ranger say something like, "Just let me know as soon as possible if anything happens." While this isn't an odd thing to say or hear, I now wonder if it held a deeper meaning. Our campsite was toward the northeast end of the camp, down in a tiny valley surrounded by rock outcroppings on the north and south. The northern outcroppings were split from east to west, and created what we called the storm shelter, basically this little crevice we'd hide in if severe weather ever sprang up. I was assigned to check up on it, make sure it was clear of debris and shit before the week started. So I walk around to the shelter, and I'm slammed with this awful smell. I knew it was something dead, and it smelled big. Once I got down into the crevice, I saw that it wasn't something big, but a bunch of smaller animals in piles. birds, foxes, raccoons, parts of deer. There was a ton of dead, mutilated bodies back there. I nearly puked, it smelled so bad. The heat didn't help either. Alarm bells weren't ringing yet, but I was definitely weirded out. I told D about it, and he said he'd have a look and clean up, and that I should just forget about it. Pick related, similar looking to the storm shelter. Monday. Our campsite was basically set up as one giant semicircle. Our tents formed a ring that almost enclosed pavilions in the center. Very little time was actually spent at our campsite, as we were all out working on our merit badges, at the mess hall, cantina, shooting range, lake, etc. There was no reason for any boy to be in camp, and it was rare to find someone who wanted to stay in camp. And Monday night we decided to shoot, or rather Dylan decided to shoot. I was a terrible shot, and didn't want to pay for ammo I'd end up wasting. We were about halfway to the range when he realized he'd forgotten his money, so we turned around and headed back towards camp. When we got there, it was empty as expected, but we noticed one of the tent flaps had been left opened. Big problem there. D was constantly on us to keep our flaps shut, so as to keep any curious woodland animals and insects out of our tents. So I walked over to zip it up, when I realized that it was still zipped and that the door had slightly ripped open. The tent had been ransacked. Sleeping bags were shredded, trunks flipped over, and supplies gone through. It was an utter wreck. I called Dylan over, and our conversation went something like, "Shit man, holy hell, who would do this?" I don't know, it wasn't one of our boys. D would make sure he'd never see the light of day again. Should we tell him? Do you want to have your head a bit off? Let's let him find it for himself. That was a stupid decision in hindsight. We should have found D and alerted him immediately, but since we didn't want to suffer his wrath, we didn't. When we got back to camp that night, everyone was on edge. All the younger boys were freaking out, whispering about Bigfoot, etc. D told us that the rest of the week, we all had to be back at camp before sundown, which I thought was kind of pointless. The tent had been ransacked during the day, but whatever. Pick related, similar to the campsite. Tuesday was actually pretty uneventful. All I recall is that some boys a couple campsites over from ours got spooked because they heard noises in and around their campsite at night. If I'm being honest, that could have been anything. There's an awful lot of animal life out in rural Oklahoma, and it's not unusual for new/amateur scouts to accidentally lure raccoons, foxes, occasionally bigger things into camp by leaving food out at night. But I still have to wonder if it was related to any other experiences that week. Wednesday was different. The bad vibes seemed to have gotten stronger. Or maybe that was just me getting more wound up, I don't know. What I do know is that the mess hall had been broken into the night before and utterly wrecked. Food had been half eaten, supplies were strewn everywhere. At least, that's what I heard. We weren't allowed up the mess hall until dinner that night, by which time the camp had cleaned everything up. Of course, everyone was on edge now. There were mutterings and whisperings, rumors circulating that basically would have been an ex-wet dream. Did you hear? They found some homeless guy camping out on the other side of the lake. Tom found some really weird footprints outside his tent last night. Did you see them? I heard some weird mating call last night. Did anyone else? Could have sworn I was being stalked while walking back to camp last night. Anyone else feel the same way? Out of all these rumors, there was one that stuck out to me after the week was over. And the only reason it did is because it reminded me of my experience on Sunday. I found a dead raccoon outside my tent last night. It was like mutilated and shit. Which one of you fuckers thought that would be funny? I guess outside of the mess hall business, Wednesday was pretty uneventful too, just really tense. Thursday. Holy shit, man. Thursday night. The camp would always sort of hold this party thing out by the main gate to sort of celebrate the hard work everyone had put in over the week. There would be a bonfire, a chuck wagon, basically the canteen on wheels, stories and songs, a lot of Boy Scout stuff, you know? Anyways, D was super against letting anyone in the troop go. He wanted to keep every boy in camp that night, but after listening to 12 and 13-year-olds whine and cry for 30 minutes, he kinda begrudgingly changed his mind and allowed them to go as long as they were escorted by the older boys. So Buck, Dylan, and I were pretty much responsible for corralling 15 middle schoolers. D said he had a meeting to go to, which I knew was a lie. Scoutmaster meetings were always held in the mornings, never at night, but what the hell. So the three of us start walking them down there. When I realized that we left the flashlights back at camp, we only have about 5 minutes of light left. I tell Dylan and Buck to go on ahead of me, but both insist on coming. In the end, Buck escorted the kids to the bonfire while Dylan and I went back to camp. This was a mistake for multiple reasons. We had only been gone about 10 minutes, which means it was almost dark once we got back. But our camp was totaled. Our pavilions had been torn down, tents and their contents were strewn about everywhere. Food was out and scattered. It was a complete mess. Alarm bells were basically screaming, code red, get the fuck out right now. But Dylan was already into the camp before I could stop him. That's when the smell hit us. The smell of dead, decaying stuff. But this time it was mixed with something else. Kind of like spoiled milk. I'm not entirely sure how to describe it. Not the burnt copper/blood scent X says is related to the goatman. I know what that smells like. This was something else. Dylan and I both agreed we needed to find D ASAP. Fate was on our side that night, because not a second later he rushed into camp in full commando mode. I'm talking giant knife on his hip, brandishing a pistol, sorry, I don't know anything about guns, and the biggest flashlights I've ever seen. Dylan and I immediately start blubbering to D about what was going on and begging for answers, and almost crying. He told both of us to shut up and the rest, but in the quietest voice I've ever heard. That's when I noticed his face for the first time. He had a gash down on the right side of his forehead that was bleeding pretty profusely, and a massive bruise beginning to envelop the left side of his face. It looked like he picked a fight with a titanium beam and lost. Let me remind you that D is about 6'7" and around 260 pounds of pure muscle. Whatever bested him was fucking strong. D beckoned us over to him, and the conversation was something like, "Where the hell are the kids?" "The bonfire, sir." "What the fuck are you two doing back here?" "We forgot the flashlight, sir." "Alright, here's what's gonna happen. Dylan, I'm gonna give you this knife, okay? Anon, you go get those flashlights you were talking about and point them towards the storm shelter. I'm going over there. If anything but me comes out, you two run like hell. Do you understand?" We nodded and off we went. He rounded the corner into the shelter, and that's about when we heard the noise. Have you ever heard someone trying to talk while choking on their own blood or something like that? The sort of gurgling, gasping noise. That's what it sounded like, mixed with a sort of low growling. Dylan and I stood there frozen for what felt like hours, but was probably more like 5 minutes when the noise abruptly ceased and D returned pale as a sheet, but in one piece. So D escorted us there, and refused to answer any of our questions or give us any sort of closure to what just happened. All he said was, "I don't think we have to worry about anything for the rest of the week." So we went to the bonfire, but Dylan and I kept to ourselves and tried to figure out what the hell was going on. When we got back to camp, we did our best to repair as much as we could in the dark. Dylan and I didn't sleep at all that night. We were wide awake. At what must have been about midnight, I heard a few noises outside and saw a flashlight beam waving around before finally coming to a still position, pointed towards the storm shelter. I poked my head out of my tent and observed D sitting in a chair, flashlight pointed at the storm shelter, watching and waiting. I watched D all night, and Friday I finally got some answers. By Friday, I mean about 6:30 in the morning. Around then, C came out of his tent and proceeded to have a not exactly quiet conversation with D. Now bear with me as I'm reconstructing this from memory, so some bits might not be entirely accurate. "Anything new?" "No, I've been out there all night. Nothing since I saw it earlier." "I still think you're wrong. They never come this far south, especially this time of year. Must have been something else." "I know what I saw, Dad. I'm telling you, they're getting bolder. Or more desperate." "Well, I'm heading to the mess hall. Need my coffee. Want anything?" And they proceeded to talk about breakfast for a while, and C eventually left. I figured if I wanted any sort of closure as to last night, now was my chance to talk to D alone. So I approached D, but before I could say anything, he turns around and gives me a look that could have curdled new milk. I stopped in my tracks, and he says, "Come, sit." So I sat next to him, and this is all I got out of him. "You were pretty brave last night, kid. Incredibly stupid, but brave." "What did you see, sir?" "Nothing." He was quiet for a good 5 minutes, and I finally mustered up the courage to ask him what the hell was going on. "Sir?" "Yeah." Pardon me, sir, but what was it? What's going on? How old are you, Anon? 15, sir. Anon, the world is a far darker place than you realize right now. You're too young. Let me give a piece of advice that you need to keep in your head during times just like this. Don't ask questions you don't want to know the answer to, or that you already know the answer to. Do I know the answer to this question, sir? Do you? It wasn't natural, was it, sir? Depends on your definition of natural. Anon, to me, the thing that terrorized us all week is as natural as any other creature in these woods and on this earth. Simply a darker side of nature. One that usually stays away from heavily trafficked areas like this. They don't like people in large groups. Then what's it doing here, sir? Honestly, Anon, I don't know. I think it got confused. Lost even. Is it gone, sir? For now, yes. I don't think it will come back while we're here. Dylan woke up about then, as did the rest of the camp, so our conversation was cut short. The rest of Friday was pretty uneventful. Dylan, Buck, and I palled around the camp for a while, talking about what we thought it was, or rather, Buck and I did. Dylan didn't really want to talk about it, and acted increasingly irritated as the day went on. Friday night all was well. I slept heavily. Had bad dreams, but I slept. Saturday. We were up about 6:30 that morning to tear down camp. I was ready to go, and even though D was reassuring Friday morning, I could tell he was eager to leave too. He was tense, and would often stop to look towards the storm shelter. About 11:30, D asked me to check the shelter area and clean it up with him, even though no one had actually used it at all that week. We got back there, and it was completely different than what I'd seen Sunday. It had been cleaned, spotlessly so, and something similar to pig-related had been marked on each side of the canyon walls. I assume it's native, but I don't know what it means, and I have never particularly cared to find out. We left about noon, and I've never gone back. So that's my big story, the one I can't really explain. I know D knew way more than he was letting on. I think Buck knew more than I did too, but he clammed up whenever I tried to talk to him about it. So X, what do you think? What was it? I think it was Native American, to say the least.